Okay, so before we start our final chapters, chapter 27 and 28, I'm just going to take you through a couple things. Hopefully you all saw my announcement. I think I posted this last night. If you could have all your lab pages done and completed by Thursday, and I haven't accepted any more missing lab work from our last lab exam, so like nervous system pages, I haven't accepted any more. Or I won't accept any more after today. So just get all your lab pages done by this Thursday. And also email me with a screenshot or picture when you've completed that SLO assessment. I've tried everything. Professors or instructors, they don't have access to seeing who's taken it. So you just need to tell me if you've taken it. And then I'll give you 5 extra credit points and I'll just add them to your final lecture exam score. That's probably the easiest way to do that. And then tonight at 8 p.m., you'll have a digestive system quiz. That'll open up, that's multiple choice, 20 questions worth 10 points. That just is a regular lab quiz. And then your lab exam 5, your final lab exam will open up on Thursday at 7 p.m. So we won't have any live lecture that night. We will have one final live study session a week from tonight on Tuesday. That's June 2nd already, wow. And that'll be for your final unit, for your final lecture exam. And that'll open on Tuesday at 8 p.m. So we'll have a short study session just going over the study guide before then. And that study guide should be in Canvas. Has anyone seen it there? Yeah.
Yes.
Perfect, so we'll go over the study guide a week from tonight. I'm not going to be recording that because it'll be the day of your final. So if you want to join, just pop on Zoom. You don't have to say anything or show us your face. You could just listen in. Okay, so yeah, then that really takes us through the rest of the semester and then we're all done. I'm sure you guys are happy to be done, but I've still missed seeing you all. Let me take us through and start the first PowerPoint. So we're going to do Chapter 27 and Chapter 28 tonight. They're both shorter PowerPoints, and I usually do them on one day in class as well. So this is urinary and reproductive. So we'll take you through some of the anatomy of the kidney. The way the kidneys function is to regulate blood volume and urine excretion. And there's a lot of physiology that goes into how urine is formed. So I'm really going to try to focus just on anatomy of your urinary system tonight. So these are functions of the urinary system that are included on number 1 of your notes. Your urinary system itself is composed of your kidneys, your ureters, the urinary bladder, and the urethra. I'll show you a picture of that. And these are all functions of the urinary system. The storage of urine in the bladder, excretion of urine, the regulation of blood volume, regulation of erythrocyte or red blood cell production. It regulates your ion levels, specifically sodium and potassium, and it regulates the acid-base balance in the blood. So all of the functions have to do with cleaning out your blood basically and getting anything bad that's in your blood out. If you've lost a lot of blood, if you've been in an accident where you're internally bleeding, your urinary system will kick into gear to try to increase blood volume. Okay. So here's a basic look at some of the things we talked about. Your kidneys lie in the back of the abdominal cavity. You have adrenal glands on top of your kidneys, which will secrete hormones in response to the stress response. And then the ureters are the tube or the duct that connects your kidneys to your bladder. So you can see the urinary bladder is located down here in the pelvic cavity. And then the urethra is the name of the tube that exits the urine out of the body. So ureter and urethra, some students get those mixed up. So make sure you know those. And this just shows where the kidneys are in relation to your inferior vena cava and your descending aorta as well. Okay, from posterior view, you can see where your left kidneys lie, right kind of below these ribs, the T12 vertebra and the 12th rib. So I don't know if you guys ever watched boxing, but a lot of times they'll aim for the kidneys as a painful place to get hit. And I don't know why people go through that. Boxing, contact sports. I'm athletic. I'm all for sports, but just don't hurt yourself too much. And you can see here how the ureters go line right on either side of the vertebra to bring the urine to the bladder. Okay, so here's the organ, the location, and the general function of the urinary system anatomy. A little bit more about where the kidneys are located. The retroperitoneal means against your posterior wall. They're at the level of about your T12 vertebra. Each kidney has what we call a hilum, and the hilum is one of your lab exam terms. That's the concave medial border where vessels, nerves, and the ureters connect. Each kidney is surrounded by several layers or tissues. The fibrous capsule is on your lab exam list, and that's the word for the dense irregular connective tissue that covers the outer surface of the kidney. The fibrous capsule, I just made your lab exam last night, and that is one of the ones you'll need to identify. So just keep that in mind. The rest of these are just extra fat and tissue that surround the kidney, that anchors the kidney to the back of the wall, and just extra fat to keep it in place. This is a transverse section of the abdomen showing that your kidneys lie in the back of the abdominal cavity on either side of the vertebra. So it's just an interesting view to see where your kidneys lie. The stomach will be in front of them, intestines will be in front of them, and the kidneys are in the back. Okay, so now it gets a little more complex. If only the urinary system was that simple. But now we're gonna dive in and look at a kidney in depth. So it's divided into an outer renal cortex layer and an inner renal medulla layer. And they are renal columns that will extend and project themselves and divide the medulla into renal pyramids. And I'll show you pictures of this. Number 2 in your notes asks you to know how much an adult typical kidney contains of those renal pyramids. You should know that an adult kidney typically has 8 to 15 renal pyramids. And I'll show you what that means in a second. The apex or tip of the renal pyramid is called a renal papilla. And the wide base of the renal pyramid makes contact with the cortex at the corticomedullary junction. Okay, so let's take a look here. This is a really good picture view. This is one that will be similar to what you'll see in your lab exam and knowing some of these anatomical terms. The fibrous capsule is the outer covering. That's kind of this reddish kidney bean color. This is your fibrous capsule, the layer of dense connective tissue that covers the kidney. And then as we look at the kidney, the lighter area is called the renal cortex. So the renal cortex is in brackets right here. You can see that it's a little bit lighter, and it's the layer of the kidney that kind of skirts the outside part of it. The renal medulla, then in brackets, includes the inner layer, and the renal medulla includes what we call these renal pyramids, and there's a renal pyramid in dotted lines here that's outlined. So this is the renal pyramid. And the apex of the renal pyramid, the part that's pointed at the end, ends in what we call the renal papilla. And the renal papilla will empty out all the urine that's formed within the renal pyramid into then this funnel system. And within this funnel system, and I'm just going to move over to the renal sinus, it says it contains a minor calyx, a major calyx, and a renal pelvis. And the renal sinus consists of this area of funnels that funnels all the urine that's being formed in the renal pyramids down through the ureter. So each minor calyx refers to that first funnel that's connected to each renal pyramid or renal papilla. And the major calyx refers to an area in the sinus where 2 or more minor calyxes come together. And then the renal pelvis refers to this central part within the kidney where the major calyxes will dump their urine or funnel their urine into. And then the renal pelvis will empty out into the ureter, which exits or takes the urine to the bladder. So just a quick review there, minor calyx is connected to each renal papilla or renal pyramid. A major calyx is where two or more minor calyxes come together. And then the renal pelvis is this central kind of collection funnel that takes all that urine formed and connects it to the ureter, which takes the urine out to the bladder. Okay, so each renal papilla from that renal pyramid projects into a hollow funnel-shaped structure called your minor calyx. Several minor calyxes together form a major calyx, which will eventually form the renal pelvis. A kidney has 8 to 15 renal lobes or renal pyramid. There's a question, where are renal pyramids located? And your renal pyramids are located within the renal medulla, because the renal cortex is the outer layer of the kidney and the renal medulla is right below that. So your renal pyramids are located within the renal medulla layer. Okay? A little bit about blood supply. I don't go over this too much. You'll probably see some of these arteries in your lab exam sheet. I can't remember if I took these off. I don't really ask you any questions about identifying these arteries. I probably should have. Blood enters your kidneys by the renal arteries. So the whole function of your kidneys is to filter blood. So we need blood to constantly be going into our kidneys. And then the renal arteries will split into segmental arteries, interlobar arteries, arcuate arteries, and interlobular arteries. And this splitting of blood vessels just shows how the kidneys take in all the blood from the renal artery. They will eventually split and divide to go to all places in the kidney. And eventually, each of these interlobular arteries, which are kind of reaching up into the cortex area, will have little chutes off of them called the afferent arterioles. And the afferent arterioles are an important blood vessel that you should know. And we have another model that will zoom in on what I'm referring to right now. But the afferent arterioles bring blood into what we call the renal corpuscle. And this is a really high-powered, high-pressured filtering system of coiled capillaries. So when blood goes into the renal corpuscle, everything, ions get filtered out of this blood, and we start to create urine that goes through the duct system. And the duct system are the ducts or tubes that are kind of this tannish color, and this is where urine will be formed or created. But the afferent arteriole brings blood into the glomerulus, and the efferent or efferent arteriole carries blood that's been filtered out of the glomerulus. Then that blood goes through a series of capillaries that are shown here. They're either peritubular capillaries that go around these convoluted tubules, or they're the vasorectal capillaries that travel along this nephron loop. But eventually those capillaries join back up to one of these veins in blue. And these veins, then this picture shows you how these veins eventually take that blood that's been filtered back out of the kidneys into the renal vein, back to your inferior vena cava, back to your heart. So all your blood has been filtered through. It's nice and clean now. Anything bad has been taken out. Because your kidneys help regulate blood fluid volume, they can absorb more ions or absorb less ions, depending on what you need your blood pressure or fluid levels to be. Really important if you're in an accident or something like that and you're internally bleeding. If your kidneys don't function, they can't go through this whole process of filtering blood, and people have to go through dialysis. You maybe know someone who needs to do that several times a week, once a week, and they get hooked up to a machine that filters all their blood for them. Okay, and we'll go through some of that in detail a little more too. So the big ones that are highlighted here are ones you should know. The afferent arterioles, bring blood into that renal corpuscle that forms that tuft of capillaries called a glomerulus. Some plasma is filtered out of the capillaries into the capsular space, and the remaining blood will exit the glomerulus as the efferent arteriole. So one way I remember this is the efferent arteriole exits the glomerulus. So E and E, efferent arteriole exits the glomerulus, and the afferent arteriole brings blood into the glomerulus. The efferent arterioles branch into one of two capillary networks. We talked about those a little bit. Your peritubular capillaries surround your convoluted tubules, and the vasa recta will surround the nephron loop, which we'll get to what those are as well. The vein supply, so the capillaries will drain into your veins by the same nomenclature as those arteries had, eventually into the renal vein. The kidney, the nerve supply to the kidney, there's a renal plexus. So at the hilum of the kidney, the renal artery, the renal vein, the renal plexus, and ureter all enter and exit the kidney at the hilum. And the hilum, again, is that concave part of the kidney where everything enters and exits. It'll be on the medial surface. And again, a plexus is just kind of a collection of nerves. Okay, so I'm still looking at, I think we're still okay for your notes. And I'll get to a picture here about the nephron. So we're going to talk about the nephron now. And this is what we call the functional filtration unit of the kidney. Each nephron consists of a renal corpuscle and a renal tubule. And this is what the renal tubule consists of: a proximal convoluted tubule, a nephron loop, and a distal convoluted tubule. There's two types of nephrons. You don't really need to know those two types, but let's take a look at a nephron itself. You can see here how the afferent arteriole, where my cursor is, brings blood into this renal corpuscle. And the structure of capillaries within the renal corpuscle is called a glomerulus. The proximal convoluted tubule is the tubule that takes anything that's filtered out of the blood first. So the proximal convoluted tubule is located closest to that renal corpuscle. That's why we call it proximal. And then it's a little hard to see, but this proximal convoluted tubule then eventually goes down and up in what we call a nephron loop with a descending limb and an ascending limb. The ascending limb leads us to the distal convoluted tubule. Again, distal because it's furthest away distance-wise from that glomerulus after the filtrate has traveled all of this way. And the distal convoluted tubule eventually leads to a central collecting duct. And each renal pyramid has one central collecting duct. So all this urine that's being formed travels through the proximal convoluted tubule, the nephron loop, into the distal convoluted tubule, and then into the collecting duct, which eventually is the first part of that funnel system leading out of the renal pyramid to the minor calyx. So that's a little bit about the tubule system. So if we look at, maybe you guys can describe this for me right now. We'll come back to number 3, the 3 components of the urinary tract in your notes. But number 4, describe the flow of urine in the renal pyramids through the kidney to the ureters. If we look at this, if we start with the collecting duct traveling down the renal pyramid itself, what does the collecting duct empty into? If we're just filling some of these notes. So the collecting duct would empty into the minor calyx. Thanks, Enrique. So each pyramid has one central collecting duct, which collects the urine that's being formed. So the minor calyx would come first in your notes under B. C would be the major calyx. You can see a major calyx is formed when 2 or more minor calyxes come together, and then they will eventually form the renal pelvis out through the ureter. So that's the answer to number 4 in your notes. Okay. Then if we answer number 5, and I'm going to go to this picture now, list the regions of the nephron in the correct order in the process of urine formation. I'm going to show you this picture for this answer to this question. So this again shows how the afferent arteriole brings blood in to the glomerular capillaries. The filtrate will get filtered out of the blood via high pressure into what we call the capsular space of the glomerulus. And from there, the filtrate goes through the proximal convoluted tubule. So PCT stands for proximal convoluted tubule. That's letter B in your notes. Then the filtrate will go down and up the loop of Henle through the distal convoluted tubule, DCT, and then out the collecting duct. So that's the process of urine formation. It goes through glomerular filtration, which happens in the glomerulus. Tubular reabsorption and tubular secretion refer to substances from the tubular fluid back into the blood or substances from the blood back into the tubular fluid. So in each location, this is where kidneys are really fun to study. In each location and part of this tubule, different ions are being reabsorbed back into the blood, into either the peritubular capillaries or the vasa recta, or ions are being pumped into your urine filtrate. And this makes sense. We all know, you know when your pee looks more yellow or more clear, that there must be more ions in it or less ions in it. Alcohol is a diuretic, so you know if you've been drinking, you pee more because that's what alcohol does. If you drink a lot of water, your pee will be lighter in color. So that idea of reabsorbing and secreting more things into your urine happens in this system. Okay, kind of talked about this. I'm gonna keep going from there. This is another look at the renal corpuscle, showing blood coming into the glomerular capsule and the glomerulus, and then the filtrate being pushed out through the proximal convoluted tubule. Okay, just looking at your notes real quick, what enters and exits the kidney at the hilum. I'm just gonna go back to one slide where we talked about that. I think I put a little asterisk here, but these are everything that enters and exits the kidney at the hilum: your renal artery, your renal vein, the renal plexus, which will be the nerves, and the ureter. So that's the answer to number 6 on your notes. And then I think we still need to do Roman numeral 3 and then the final one too. Okay, am I going too fast? Are you guys still with me kind of? Did you say something, Sharice?
No, I don't know.
Okay,
Yeah.
oh sorry, I figured.
Okay.
This is just a look at the glomerular capsule itself in the glomerulus and how there are filtration slits between the capillaries to allow substances to get through. Okay, the filtration membrane, which is what we just talked about, it's fenestrated, it's porous, there's podocytes, there's filtration slits. It's just the role of the nephron where things will get filtered through, usually ions, sodium, potassium. Proteins and red blood cells should, red blood cells should not be able to fit through those slits. So if you see blood in your urine, that's a cause for concern. Oh, yeah, did you guys want me to go back to that slide for the, I can head back there really quick. Just looking at the chat right now. Let me head back to this slide where we talked about what enters and exits the kidney at the hilum. I know that I kind of went through that fast. So here's what enters and exits the kidney at the hilum: renal artery, renal vein, plexus, and ureter. Okay. So yeah, red blood cells should not be able to fit through those filtration slits. So if you do get, you see blood in your urine, that's usually a cause for concern. And that's usually a problem at the glomerular level. So either things are being filtered at too high of a pressure, you have high blood pressure, maybe those filtration slits are allowing red blood cells to get through when they shouldn't be. You also shouldn't see a lot of protein in your urine. That can sometimes be a cause for concern as well. And that's usually a test they would take through a urine sample. Okay, can't even remember where we are. The proximal convoluted tube. Okay, so we're gonna go through some of these tubules a little more in detail. You don't need to know what happens in each process. You just need to be able to identify the different tubules. So the proximal convoluted tubule starts at the renal corpuscle, and it will reabsorb almost all nutrients leaked through that filtration membrane. And this is just another view of the convoluted tubule and the nephron loop system here. So proximal convoluted tubule is directly attached to the renal corpuscle. Then we have a nephron loop, and then we have a distal convoluted tubule being attached to the collecting duct. A little bit of the histology. If you remember simple cuboidal epithelium, you probably remember this from our first couple weeks of school. That simple cuboidal, I always told you, was found in the urinary system or your kidneys, and it's actually found in these ducts, whether that is the collecting tubule or the nephron loop. Okay, then the nephron loop, also called the loop of Henle, so you'll see it listed as that or both on your lab exam. There's a descending limb and an ascending limb, and we differentiate the two because different physiological things happen in each side of the loop. And especially sodium and chloride are reabsorbed in the limb. And then the distal convoluted tubule is the furthest away from the glomerulus. It responds to ADH and aldosterone. So ADH and aldosterone will both increase water reabsorption and sodium reabsorption back into the blood. So if you have lost a lot of blood, ADH and aldosterone are two hormones that'll act on the distal convoluted tubule and tell this tubule to reabsorb more things back into the blood. This is probably a situation where you're going through low blood pressure, or low fluid, or loss of fluid or blood from an injury. So here are the structures, the descriptions. You don't have to know their functions and what they all do. Okay, this is a little more about the histology. The collecting tubule is empty into the collecting ducts. Again, the tubular fluid is under the influence of different hormones that modify what will go into it and what will go out of it. But let's move on. You don't need to know that physiology for now. The urinary tract itself consists of these three components. And this is the answer to number 3. And this will be a lecture exam question on your final. I ask what your urinary tract is composed of. And it doesn't include the kidney itself. The urinary tract just is composed of the flow of urine after the kidney itself. So your ureters, the urinary bladder, and the urethra are these three components for the urinary tract. So the two ureters, they're a fibromuscular tube. They will start at the hilum of the kidney and then enter the base of the bladder in the back of the wall. Your ureter has 3 layers to it. You don't need to know that. You just need to know that the ureters connect your kidneys to your bladder.
Okay.
The main function of your urinary bladder is to store urine. It's right behind your pubic symphysis, if you remember where that was from the skeletal system. In females, the urinary bladder lies kind of on top of the uterus, or right underneath the uterus, excuse me. And then in males, the urinary bladder lies right in front of the rectum and superior to the prostate gland. And we'll kind of go over that more when we get to reproductive. Here's a little anatomy of the bladder itself. So the ureters enter the bladder from the posterior side. Rugae are inner muscular folds of the bladder. You can see here the urethral openings are where the ureters are connected. And the trigone is just an area of a triangular kind of shape to the bladder that will eventually kind of lead the urine to flow out of the urethra. You have an internal and an external urethral sphincter, which are the external urethral sphincters under voluntary control. Here's a look at an empty bladder. and a distended or stretched out full bladder. And if you remember from histology, this transitional epithelium, those cells looked like balloons that could be squished when your bladder's empty, or squished when the bladder's full, and then kind of regain their shape when the bladder's empty. So an empty bladder has an upside down shape. The posterior inferior triangular area is called that trigone area. So it's more anatomy of the bladder. There's 4 layers or tunics that form the bladder wall. I won't ask you guys to know those. The rugae, though, are muscular folds within the bladder, just allow for further distension or stretching out. Micturition is the medically correct term for expulsion of urine. It's controlled by the micturition reflex, which is an extension of the bladder. So when your bladder expands, that excites stretch receptors, which tell your brain and spinal cord to start this reflex. So the parasympathetic nervous system sends those signals to your internal urethral sphincter to relax it, and the detrusor muscle to excite it. So there's a part of the micturition or expulsion of urine that's under involuntary control. It's a natural reflex, but what you and I can control is this voluntary relaxation of the external urethral sphincter, and that's how you can control going to the bathroom. My 2-year-old just had an accident tonight. We're working on potty training. I just thought about that. Abdominal muscle contraction also could help empty the bladder. The urethra then is a fibromuscular tube starting at the bladder, takes it to the exterior of the body. There's 2 sphincters. One's under involuntary control. One is under voluntary control, so we can control that. Obviously, the urethras are different lengths in males and females, and we'll go over kind of those differences in a couple minutes. Other differences are that the female urethra only transports urine, but the male urethra is a little more complex because it transports both urine and semen, but not simultaneously. They have to keep that in there, which is probably good. So there's different parts of the male urethra. The prostatic urethra goes through the prostate gland. And we'll talk about these 3 parts when we get into the next chapter here. The opening is called the external urethral orifice. So whenever you see the word orifice, especially in reproductive terminology, that just means opening. Okay, so how your urinary system is aging, blood flow decreases with age, your nephrons don't lose their functionality, they don't respond to aldosterone, ADH, so you can see why dialysis is pretty common in elderly. There's less control of blood volume, blood pressure, your bladder decreases in size and loses muscle tone, and control of that external urethral sphincter may be lost, leading to incontinence. And incontinence is the medically correct term for just the inability to control that voluntary reflex, or the voluntary reflex of expelling your urine. Okay? Okay, so without further ado then.
Professor?
Yeah.
Sorry, I missed number 4. What was the answer to number 4?
Number 4. So describe the flow of urine in the renal pyramids. It starts from the cortical collecting duct, and then it goes to the minor calyx, was B, and C was major calyx, and D is renal pelvis.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Other questions? What are changes to the urinary system due to aging? We kind of went over those fast as well, but I think we answered all of them. Oh yeah, knowing how to label this diagram on the back of your notes, I include that diagram. That's a pretty good diagram just showing the different tubules and what they're all named. So knowing that for a lab exam is good too. Okay. Okay, so the last PowerPoint isn't as long, and it's reproductive. I try to keep it pretty simple because by this point in the semester, everyone's kind of ready to be done. Can you guys see my PowerPoint on the screen right now? Okay, so chapter 28 We'll go over males and females and basically how the reproductive system ages. So I think we start with a couple of terminologies. You should know the difference between gonads and gametes. And the gonads refer to the primary sex organs, which are the ovaries in the female and testes in the male. And we'll talk about why female gonads are inside the body and male testes have to be located outside the body. Gonads produce sex cells called gametes. So gametes is the right anatomical term for a sex cell, and that is either an oocyte or an egg in simple terms, and sperm in the male. So knowing the difference between what a gonad is and what a gamete is. Both systems basically are set up with a duct system to transport their gametes from their gonads to the site of fertilization. So simply put, that's what reproduction is. We look at the duct system, which is transporting these sex cells, the gametes, from where they're produced in the gonads to the site of fertilization. So that's kind of how we're gonna go over this. So everything's kind of dormant until puberty. And then at puberty, external sex characteristics become prominent, reproductive organs become functional, gametes mature, and gonads start secreting sex hormones. That's mainly testosterone in males. Puberty starts when the hypothalamus increases the release of the gonadotropin releasing hormone. And that's the answer to number 3. So hopefully you were able to fill out numbers 1 and 2 in your notes. The gonads and gametes for males and females. And then number 3 in your notes, puberty is initiated by secretion of gonadotropin releasing hormone. You should know that it's gonadotropin, and it's also abbreviated GnRH, if that helps. So gonadotropin releasing hormone is secreted from your hypothalamus and then acts on your pituitary gland to secrete follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. And those will be the 2 hormones that stimulate your gonads to start secreting their sex hormone or their sex cells. All right, so we'll start with female. We look at the ovaries as the primary sex organ, and then the accessory sex organs are listed there as well. So this is a typical sagittal view of the reproductive system. I use sagittal views like this. For the male, and for the female, I might show a different angle, which I showed you, but you should be familiar with how to identify these structures on a sagittal view like this, or on a frontal view. And I'll show you those 2 examples. So if we start with the ovary, so we'll always start where the sex cell or the gamete, the oocyte, will be created, and then how it will go through the duct system. So the ovary creates the oocytes, which will go through, the uterine tube, and the uterine tube carries the oocyte to the uterus, which will be the site for implantation if that oocyte was fertilized. If the oocyte was not fertilized, the walls of the uterus will get sloughed off, and that's known as your monthly menstrual cycle if that oocyte does not get fertilized. Also, you can see here the cervix of the uterus is what we call the base or the opening part of the uterus itself. And then the vagina will be this opening. So moving from ourselves from like front to back, the female has kind of 3 openings versus the male just has 2. So remember the last chapter said urine only travels out of the urethra, and the females and its sex cells, the gametes, will travel out of the vagina, and then the rectum will be in the back. And we'll see how this kind of is set up differently in the males. A couple other things. What else was I going to say? You can see here how the uterus lies right on top of the bladder. So this is why women who are pregnant have to pee all the time, because as the uterus expands, that's pushing down on the bladder, and it doesn't leave for a lot of space for urine to collect. Okay, I'm going to keep going here, and we'll look at a different view of that. So the ovaries are paired oval organs. They're anchored within the pelvic cavity by cords and sheets of connective tissue. And these are 3 different kind of anchors. They're either ligaments or connective tissue that anchor the ovaries to the pelvic cavity. You don't need to know those. But this is a look at how the uterus and the ovaries are all anchored within the pelvic cavity, which is good for everything to be held together in place so that nothing can shift around. One thing I'm going to point out are these fimbriae, and the fimbriae aren't directly attached to the ovary. So between the ovary and the uterine tube is a space. So for the oocyte to get out of the ovary and into the uterine tube, it needs a little bit of help. And fimbriae act as like fingers to kind of wave the egg into the uterine tube. So that's the function of the fimbriae. They help to kind of guide or wave the egg into the uterine tube. Okay. Here's a look at a cadaver view showing the urinary bladder and the uterus right behind it. The mons pubis refers to kind of a layer of fat that's right in front of the urinary bladder and the pubic symphysis. Here's a look at the stages of oocyte development. We go over this a little bit. You don't need to know this. You should only know that these primordial follicles are arrested. So these eggs are arrested in stage 1 of development until puberty happens, and that's when girls start to get their menstrual cycles or periods. So girls are born with the kind of a finite number of eggs when they're born. They don't create any more eggs. They're just born with the number of eggs they'll have for the rest of their lives. And then at puberty, the eggs will be released once a month in that cycle. Males create sperm on a daily basis. They create sperm up until they're 80. That's why you hear of men who are 80 becoming dads or something like that. So these are ovarian follicles. It consists of an oocyte surrounded by follicle cells, and there's different types of ovarian follicles, each representing a different stage of development. And I just want you to focus on this primordial follicle is the primary oocyte. That's just a single layer of cells. It actually appears during fetal development. So if I have a girl in my belly right now, which I don't know, could be, she actually has all the eggs in her ovaries right now that she'll have for the rest of her life, which is kind of crazy to think about. But starting at puberty, then the eggs or the oocytes will start to develop into primary follicles, secondary, and eventually a mature follicle that'll be released and hopefully, not hopefully, but it'll either be fertilized or not. Okay, so this is fetal life, oogonia. The process of egg formation starts, and at birth you have about 1.5 million of those primordial follicles. During childhood, the ovaries are inactive. But from puberty to menopause, females show a monthly reproductive cycle, and that's the release of these more mature oocytes that will get released in hopes of getting fertilized. So we have what we call an ovarian cycle, which is determined by monthly variations in hormone levels. There's what we call a follicular phase, an ovulation phase, and a luteal phase. In the follicular phase, these oocytes are maturing to get ready to be released. Each oocyte ends up with 23 chromosomes because a sperm will have the other 23 chromosomes to make 46 chromosomes. But ovulation will occur around day 14 of this cycle, and this occurs from a peak in luteinizing hormone. This is an answer to number 4 in your notes. A peak in luteinizing hormone secretion causes these mature follicles to swell, rupture, and expelling their secondary oocyte, which will get released into the uterine tube. So luteinizing hormone, abbreviated LH, causes ovulation. You should know that.
You said number 4, right?
Yes, Roman numeral number 4. So that's a luteinizing hormone, LH. The cells will become the corpus luteum, which will be like helper cells. They'll help secrete progesterone and estrogen to prepare for a possible pregnancy. And that's the luteal phase. So we have this cycle of hormones throughout the month. This is a look at oogenesis and how they start at primordial follicles and eventually create an oocyte. You don't have to know that development. Female reproductive cycles showing the levels of hormones that occur to help with ovulation, the menstrual flow, the different phases, excuse me. But LH, you can see here, is the big one in green. And you can see how the big surge in LH, that's luteinizing hormone, will occur right around day 14 to initiate ovulation or the egg release from the ovary. So people trying to get pregnant they can actually measure their hormone levels. So they'll measure their luteinizing hormone levels because they know once that level is extremely high, their egg is being released soon. The bottom graph shows the thickness of the wall of the uterus. So you can see here around the proliferative and secretory phase, the wall of the uterus gets a lot thicker to prepare for implantation. So it gets extremely thick right after day 14, right after ovulation, because it thinks that that egg will become fertilized and it wants a really thick wall or area for that fertilized egg to implant. And if there's no implantation of an egg, then all of this gets sloughed off as the blood of the menstrual cycle or menstrual flow. Okay, uterine tubes, also known as fallopian tubes, they extend laterally from the sides of the uterus towards the ovaries. The normal site of fertilization is in the uterine tube. So that's a question. Where's the normal site of fertilization? It's in the lateral part of that uterine tube. Once fertilization occurs within the uterine tube, it usually takes that pre-embryo about 3 days to travel the length of the uterine tube and actually reach the uterus itself where it'll implant. These uterine tubes are about 10 to 12 centimeters in length. They're covered by a mesosalpinx, which is just part of the ligament that holds everything together in the uterus. Infundibulum is a funnel-shaped region that'll have the fimbriae, and the purpose of the fimbriae is in bold there, and that's the answer to number 5 in your notes. They will enclose the ovary at the time of ovulation. The ampulla is the specific part in the uterine tube where fertilization typically occurs. I think you guys, for your lecture exam, I just want you to know fertilization occurs in the uterine tubes, but within that uterine tube, there's a region called the ampulla, and that's the expanded region where it will normally occur, and I'll show you a picture. Then we have an isthmus and a uterine part. So here's the fimbriae attaching itself to the uterine tube, and here on the right side of the screen, you can see the uterine tube in sections. The uterine part, the isthmus, the ampulla, the infundibulum. And again, the fimbriae are these finger-like projections that help get the egg into the uterine tube itself. Because again, the ovary and the uterine tube are not directly connected. There's a space there. Okay.
A quick question.
Yeah.
For number 5, the fimbriae, you said it was wave-like into the uterine tube and it also encloses the ovary at time of ovulations. Which one do we need to know?
We'll use this one, the one I have highlighted here.
Enclose the ovary at time of ovulation.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's not like a complete enclosure, but it'll help to like form kind of a space around the ovary to bring in that egg. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Good question. Okay. What else about this? I'm trying to think of other things I can tell you that are lab exam related. You should know the layers of the walls of the uterus. The endometrium is the innermost layer. The myometrium is the thick muscular layer of the uterus. And the perimetrium is the outermost layer. Here's the cervix itself, which consists of os, which are like opening or mini sphincters. And then the cervical canal, the vagina. Just trying to think of other things to highlight for your lab exam. We'll get to what layer of the uterine wall is sloughed off next with this. Okay, so the uterus is a pear-shaped, thick-walled, muscular organ. That myometrium has smooth muscles, so it's an involuntary response. It possesses a lumen that's continuous with the uterine tubes above it and the vagina right below it. You can have a normally angled anterior superiorly uterus that's facing kind of towards the front, or you can have a uterus that's facing posterior superiorly, projecting towards the rectum. So anteverted or retroverted. Not sure if there's an advantage to either. I don't know. Uterine function, specifically, that's the site of implantation, supports and protects the developing embryo, and then will eject the fetus during labor with that layer of smooth muscle, involuntary. 4 regions of the uterus: the fundus, the body, the isthmus, and the cervix. I don't think I even get that detailed on your lab exam, but you should know what the cervix is, and that's the narrow inferior part of the uterus itself. Muscles. Support of the uterus has muscles on the pelvic floor, round ligaments, cervical ligaments, other ligaments to help kind of keep that uterus in place. Weakness of this support can result in prolapse, in which the uterus can actually protrude through the vagina. I'm only familiar with this because I knew of a young girl, or even a 2 or 3-year-old, who had prolapse of their uterus. So it's something that can occur in even young kids, but they can grow out of that. And I think as the ligaments get stronger, it can kind of take care of itself. Blood supply to the uterus needs oxygen just like every other cell in the body. So we have uterine arteries. Then here we get to the uterine wall layers. The perimetrium is the outermost layer. Myometrium is the thick middle tunic. And the endometrium will be the innermost layer. And the part that'll get sloughed off every month, if there's no implantation of a fertilized egg, is called the functional layer of the endometrium. So there's a deeper layer and then a superficial layer. And this superficial layer, the functional layer of the endometrium, is the part of the wall that gets sloughed off during menstruation. So it changes thickness during uterine cycle and is shed as menses if fertilization, if implantation occur. Menses is the correct medical term for menstruation. If you guys are Big Bang Theory people, Sheldon always refers to menstruation as menses. I don't know if you guys ever watched The Big Bang Theory, but it's kind of funny, I think. Okay, all right. Then we get a uterine cycle. So we had an ovarian cycle with changes to how your oocytes are created. The uterine cycle refers to the changes in that endometrium layer. So we have a menstrual phase, which would be your days of bleeding. The proliferative phase would be the development of that layer after it had been lost. And the secretory phase would be increased vascularization and development of uterine glands due to high progesterone levels. So this secretory phase is just getting that endometrial layer much thicker. You can see it happens right after day 14 or 15 when ovulation would occur. So just to get things ready for possible fertilization and implantation. Okay. Cycles. The 2 hormones that I want you guys to know are the gonadotropin releasing hormone, which stimulates, which will begin puberty. And then the luteinizing hormone is what will stimulate ovulation. So those are the 2 hormones I want you guys to know. You'll learn all the rest in physiology. Lots to look forward to. Okay, the vagina, it's about 10 centimeters in length. This will be basically your birth canal. There's folds of mucosa that form a barrier called the hymen. Let's see here. And then we get to mammary gland, which is another accessory organ because it would provide milk, and it's included in reproductive because it only basically works or functions if there's a birth of a child. So otherwise your mammary glands don't produce milk. So this is your mammary gland, made up of a lot of fat and ducts. So breast cancer can be incredibly dangerous if you find a lump in one of your breasts, and it does turn out to be cancerous because of where it's located in the body and also because of the duct system. So things can travel quickly through the fat, through the duct system, and also it's located near your armpit where there's a lot of lymph nodes or lymph nodules, which could spread any cancer cells a little more quickly. More about the mammary glands. You guys don't need to know any more than this, so I'm going to kind of keep going from there. Okay, so then we'll get to males. Females were a little more complicated. Males are a little more straightforward. So again, the primary male sex organs, the gonads are the testes, and then the gametes will be the sperm cells. So within the male, we're just going to look at the tubular duct system. Again, the purpose of reproduction is to create a sex cell, fertilize it, and then get it out of the body. So males is the same way. This sagittal view of the males is one I think I use on your lab exam, one you should be familiar with and study. So if we look at here, the scrotum consists of the testes, which is the male organ, and the epididymis, which is where sperm stay until they're mature. Then sperm will travel out of the ductus deferens or vas deferens, up around by the bladder. Behind the bladder, it'll travel through the seminal vesicle, the prostate gland, and then out through the urethra. And we'll talk about what they each do. The testes need to be held outside of the body because sperm can only be produced and mature if they're at about 2 to 3 degrees Celsius cooler than normal body temperature. So that's why males have their testes outside of the body. So the scrotum is a skin-covered sac. It keeps the sperm developing successfully about 2 to 3 degrees below normal body temperature. We'll just keep going from there. And we'll talk about where sperm specifically are produced in the testes. Another look at the testes. So the nerves, blood vessels travel up and down this, what we call the spermatic cord, which includes the ductus deferens, the pammiform plexus, which are your nerves, and the testicular artery and testicular nerve. This spermatic cord is important for a couple of different reasons. When boys are, I should say, when male fetuses are developing, sometimes their testes don't descend all the way in premature infants. So that usually happens with time. But your testes will descend through what we call this superficial inguinal ring. So males are a little, I don't know what to say, vulnerable in their anatomy down there because they have kind of basically a hole in their abdominal wall where their testes will descend. Because this is not a very strong wall, males often develop hernias more than females, usually due to heavy lifting or a lot of strain. There's basically an opening where their testes have descended in the spermatic cord, and a hernia is caused when an intestine, usually a small intestine, can sneak out through the superficial inguinal ring. So you'll hear of hernias sometimes affecting males more often than females because there's basically a hole in their abdomen with a lot of straining your intestines can slip out of. So males, if you notice any bulging down there, you should really get it checked out because it could be a hernia. What they would do is they would push your intestines back in through the spermatic cord and then put a mesh-like structure to try to cover up that hole so no intestines would get out. Okay. Each testes is an oval organ. The functions include production of sperm and the secretion of androgens, which are sex hormones, especially testosterone. So when males go through puberty, it's really their testosterone coming out of your testes that's causing you to go through puberty. Okay, a little bit more about the testes itself. The seminiferous tubules, which are here, are tightly coiled tubules, and this is where sperm are produced. So this is the answer to number 8. Sperm are produced in the seminiferous tubules. From the seminiferous tubules, sperm will travel to the epididymis, which I think it kind of looks like a worm-like structure. It sits on top of the testes, and sperm will remain in the epididymis until they're fully mature, and then they'll travel out of the ductus deferens. A little more, the white fibrous capsule, mediastinum testes. The septa are the little subdivisions within the testes that form the lobules, and within each lobule it contains those 4 convoluted seminiferous tubules, and that's where sperm will be formed. All right, so spermatogenesis occurs in the seminiferous tubules we talked about. We're not going to really go through spermatogonia refers to the maturation of those sperm cells. We're not really going to go through that. We'll go through the ducts leading throughout to get the sperm out of the males itself. Where are spermatozoa stored until they're fully mature? I think, did I cross that yet? I don't think so. The answer to number 9, where are spermatozoa stored until they're fully mature, that's the epididymis. And I think that might be coming up in a slide coming up here. Okay, so let's go through this duct system that will lead the sperm up from the testes and out of the body. Okay, so really simply put, this duct system is really anatomically what you need to know for the lab exam and for lecture 2. But the seminiferous tubule are where sperm are formed. They're stored in the epididymis until they're fully mature. They travel up through the ductus deferens. The ductus deferens travels along the posterior side of the bladder, and as it travels, it will pick up secretions from 3 different glands: the seminal vesicle, the prostate gland, and these 2 little tiny bulbal urethral glands. The secretions that the sperm pick up from these glands are important to try to counteract any sort of acidity or hostile environment of the vagina. So when we combine the sperm with the secretions from these 3 different glands, that's what we call semen, and that's what will exit out of the body. I think we'll go through those glands individually here. Okay, so the rete testes, the efferent ductals, connect the rete testes to the epididymis. Here we go. So the epididymis itself is what stores sperm cells and assists in their maturation. And again, it's made of a little head, body, and tail. It sits on top of the testes itself. From there, sperm leaving the epididymis goes through the ductus deferens or the vas deferens, and it will approach the prostate gland behind the bladder. It will enlarge to form an ampulla. And an ampulla, the ductus deferens, unites with the proximal portion of the seminal vesicle to form the ejaculatory duct. The ejaculatory duct is the tiny part of the vas deferens that goes through the prostate gland, and it will connect with the prostatic urethra. The urethra then transports semen from both the ejaculatory duct and, whoops, let me see here. Can never see the top of my slide, to the outside of the body. And then the male urethra is subdivided in these 3 regions that we talked a little bit about in the urinary system. The prostatic urethra goes to the prostate gland, the membranous urethra, and then the spongy urethra. So these 3 different glands, I just want to see if I have another picture coming up here. I'm just going to go back to one picture really quick because we're going to be talking a lot. I just want to make sure we're all on the same page here of what I'm talking about. When I talk about the ejaculatory duct, I'm referring to this part from the vas deferens that goes through the prostate gland and meets up with the prostatic urethra. So where my cursor is right now, this is the prostatic urethra. It's the urethra coming right from the bladder that's going through the prostate gland. So here's your ejaculatory duct meeting up with the prostatic urethra to form one spongy urethra as it exits out of the body. So I just wanted to point those out. This is also a good view of the seminal vesicle in the backside of the bladder, the prostate gland, and also these bulbal urethral glands, which are the 3 glands that secrete this extra fluid. Real quick about the prostate gland, males, when you're in your 40s or 50s, you'll start to get prostate exams, which are a little bit uncomfortable, although they'll feel the prostate gland for any hardness or enlargements. And the best way to feel the prostate gland is through the anus. So it's a little bit uncomfortable, but it's a really important test that males should get done. I think, is it every year, every 5 years? They can also check for enzymes that could mean there's prostate cancer. A lot of times when there's prostate cancer, it happens too fast and there's nothing that can be done at it at the time. So males, just keep that in mind when you get older. Not pleasant, but important to avoid an opposite thing that could happen. Okay, I try to put in all these plugs for health, but. All right, now where we were. Thanks for your patience. I just wanted to go back to that slide quick. Okay, so let's talk about these 3 different glands that secrete fluid to mix with sperm to create the seminal fluid or semen. The function of this fluid from these glands just help to nourish the sperm and neutralize the acidity of the vagina, because the end goal of whether the sperm want to or not or whether the person wants to or not, the sperm want to fertilize an egg. So these glands will try to help with that. Seminal vesicles, prostate gland, bulbal urethra. Seminal vesicles on the back side of the bladder. They secrete a viscous whitish yellow alkaline fluid, which means it's more basic to, again, counteract acidity from the vagina, which of the male accessory glands encircles the urethra. We'll talk about that. Then the prostate gland, you can see here, the prostate gland is the male accessory gland that encircles the urethra. So you can see here the prostate gland and the urethra goes directly through it. So your answer to number 10, which of the male accessory glands encircles the urethra? That's your prostate gland. And that's shown here. The prostate gland is located right below the urinary bladder. It encircles the urethra. It produces a more acidic mucin secretion. It also secretes prostatic specific antigen, PSA, an enzyme that helps liquefy semen. And PSA is an antigen that they will check. I think elevated levels of PSA could indicate prostate cancer. Then the bulbal urethral glands, they're a little bit smaller. They secrete more clear viscous mucin. They'll lubricate the urethra prior to ejaculation. I can't see the top of my slide here. Semen then is all the fluid and the sperm. When released during intercourse, we call that ejaculate, and it normally measures about 3 to 5 milliliters in volume and contains about 200 and 500 million sperm. And yet it's still sometimes hard for people to get pregnant. You think, man, with that much sperm in one egg, it should happen every time. But first, it doesn't always happen that easily. All right, so aging in the reproductive system. You guys are troopers. We're almost done here. Reproductive systems are non-functional until puberty. In females, your gametes, your eggs will stop maturing. So they'll just kind of slough off around your 40s or 50s with menopause. So this will cause some atrophy of your reproductive organs. Menopause can also increase risk of heart disease and osteoporosis, and that's just due to hormonal changes that are occurring because you don't have as many hormones going through your monthly cycle if you're not producing these eggs. Males, testosterone can decline in your 50s, could experience prostate enlargement, which not always leads to cancer, but it could be a possibility. And many experience erectile dysfunction and impotence, which are kind of one and the same. And that is the end of reproductive.